Welcome back, dear viewer, to the third and final part of the fire tutorial series. In the last part, we looked at dressing up our fire to actually look like real fire. And in this part, we're going to look at putting the final finishing touches on the fire with some smoke and some embers. So, without any further ado, let's jump into this tutorial. So here we are back inside of Nuke, right where we left off in the last part. And if you recall, what we've made so far is this gorgeous looking fire simulation. But something seems to be missing. And if you ask me, well, I think it could sure use some embers and some smoke to really make for a consummate fire experience. So let's take a look at this reference here, our second reference clip, and see what we can see. Okay, so first things first, I think we should focus on the embers. And what I notice here is that the embers are basically just little glowing dots that move through the air, that flicker in brightness, and they move in a sort of turbulent pattern. So given what we know about particles, that should actually be pretty easy to do. So let's just go ahead and give it a try. Okay, so I'm gonna just move all of our existing stuff over to the side a little bit so we can branch off and have some room to work. And then I'm going to tab into the 3D workspace and get started here. So I want to use the same exact emission geometry that we've used for our fire. So we have, the same base. But I'm going to make a new particle emitter. And I'll plug the emit input over into our base geometry. So, all right, now we've got some particles to work with. They do seem to have some of the similar issues to the other particles when we first started out. They're going way too fast, and they all die at the same time. It doesn't look very realistic. So I'm going to decrease the velocity down to something slower. And I want these particles to kind of linger for a while. So I'm going to give them a lifetime of maybe 30 frames. And we'll increase the lifetime range so that they die at random times. Okay. That is looking more like it. Now, I think it's maybe a little bit too dense. Bring down the emission rate to 5, perhaps. It's looking more like it. And now we got to give it some more interesting looking motion. So we already know particle turbulence is going to be great for this. Got turbulent motion, so particle turbulence. There we go. And right now it's doing nothing because we got no strength. So I'm going to copy our first slider over so we can easily adjust a uniform strength. Now we're talking. This is getting us somewhere. I'm thinking we might not want to affect the Y strength so much because I don't want the particles moving downward as much as they are right now. So I'm going to unlink this control and set it to something really low. I still want a little bit of randomness in there, so maybe 0.01. See how that looks. Yeah, that's a little bit more like it. I think overall the strength is too much, so maybe 0.03 or something for the other ones. And even that's a little too much. 0.2, perhaps? Oh yeah, now we're getting somewhere. I also want to animate the offset just like we did before, bringing it up on the y-axis. We'll do frame divided by something big like 50. And now that'll slowly evolve the sort of turbulent patterns that we're seeing in here. Maybe I'll bring down the scale of the noise just a little bit. Oh, and actually, we need to increase the scale in order to make the pattern smaller. So 1.5 or something. Yeah. Something like that, perhaps. 1.3. Oh. Okay. How's that looking versus our original clip? Nice. Cool. Okay, now let's look at the particle sprites here. We probably want just some little dots. That should be easy enough to do. We'll go with a reformat node to set our particle scale. To begin with, we want something really small because the particles will be small. So we'll do 2 box here and make it, I don't know, 40 pixels. 40 by 40, like that. And then we'll do a radial, like this. Bring it out to the edges. And we'll hook this up to the particle input on the emitter. Now what do we got? They're actually still too big, in my opinion. So we will bring down the size, something even smaller. And actually, I think they're probably moving a little bit too fast too. So I'm going to bring down the velocity even more. I like them to be slow and meandering. This maybe bring down the strength of the particle turbulence even further. I had to really back this off. Yeah, there we go. That's nice. And I'll give it a little bit more lifetime so it has some more room to actually go anywhere. Maybe 40. Cool. That's looking good. All right. Also, velocity range. Why not? Let's bring that up and get some more randomness in there. And that seemed to actually increase the overall velocity, so I'll bring that back down a little bit to compensate. There we go. That's nice. Nice. Might give it even less on the y-axis here. Yeah. Cool. We'll call that good for the motion for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring down a second scanline render node. I'll just copy and paste this one, plug that into our object scene here, and we'll use the exact same camera. And the reason I'm using a separate scanline render is because I actually do want to calculate motion blur with this one. So I will do a little, bring up our samples here to something like 15. Yeah, now we've got those little blurry edges on this. And just to make it a little bit less distracting when they disappear, bring down a particle curve as well, and give it a soft sort of bell curve looking shape on the alpha, like this. And if you recall, it's not actually going to do anything until we use this blend mat, just like we did in the last episode. Put this down, blend mat. We want to set this to plus, and we want to set this to modulate. And now that's working better. And to give it a little bit of flickering, we could find a way to do this with maybe setting the alpha on the curve to sort of random shape, or we could just do something as easy as multiplying the output of the scanline render by a noise texture that is animated like this. Go in here, make it a very simple noise texture, something with not many octaves of detail, maybe 2. We'll just animate the Z to be something like this, maybe frame divided by 10. Like that. And then we just multiply in this merge node. Oh, we'll go with something much smaller on the size because we want the flickering to be kind of per particle. Okay, that's looking pretty good, but I think we could go even faster with the flickering. Yeah. I'll open up this expression again and bring it down to maybe divided by 4 on here, which will make the animation go faster. Give us a look like this. Now we've got some flickering going on. So what we can do now is just a simple 2D composite of these two renders like this. We'll do a merge node and we'll just set this to plus, and then I want the embers to be on top. So just Shift X to swap the inputs. Okay. So skip over towards the end of the scene so we can let the particles fully, distribute here. And that is looking pretty good. I think, for one thing, I noticed that they're the wrong color. I want to put a grade on this and shift it more towards orange. Maybe make them brighter as well. And I think they could use a little bit more lifetime. Maybe 50. There we go. I think we could even go smaller on the size. Looking at that reference quickly, smaller on the size and brighter in color. And let's just have a look at how this looks in motion. All right, that is looking pretty nice. And let's just compare over to our reference clip. think they actually need a little bit more upward velocity, and they also need a little bit less turbulent velocity. So go over into the emitter settings here, bring up the velocity to 0.035, and then keep the turbulence the same. How are we looking here? Oh, a little bit less turbulence. We want to do... Strength is really a lot less than I thought it would be. Maybe 0.06? There we go. Now what happens if we do increase the Y here? Now we've got an extra boost there. That's too much, but 0.04, yeah, we get some more swirling sort of patterns this way. Okay, we'll leave the settings there and take one more look at our results. Oh, I think I want to boost up the brightness of this just a little bit more. Yeah, maybe down the gamma as well. Okay, all together. That is what I'm looking for there. All right, more like it, huh? Original. There's this. Looking good. Okay, let's move on to the smoke, shall we? Okay, so having another look at the reference, what do we see here? Well, I'm noticing the shape of the smoke reminds me a lot of fractal noise. So that's looking good for us, but the motion of the smoke is a little bit more complicated. So we're not going to be able to do any actual fluid simulations or anything, so we got to think, how can we just estimate this motion with something simpler? And what I'm noticing, a rotopaint node time, the smoke sort of seems to be getting sucked up and towards the center, a little bit like that. And if you think about this, it's kind of like a little rotating motion that we've got here. And, you know, you can see that in action if we play the video here. Yeah. So I think what we should do is have some particle sprites that rotate towards the center of the fire as they move up. And then we can sort of mask the smoke to be illuminated by the glow of the fire later on. I think that'll look pretty good. But first, we have to figure out how we're going to make particle sprites rotate. Okay, so I'm going to set up quickly a third particle system and a third renderer here because it's convenient to be able to do these things separately. I'm going to grab the particle emitter from the embers, just copy and paste that to save some time. And we'll plug in our emit to our base emitter like we had before. And actually what I want to do is scale up the base a little bit before we emit smoke from it, because I noticed the smoke seems to come from a bit outside the fire in this clip, especially if we're going to have our particles sort of rotate around towards the fire. We want to have it be a little bit wider. So we can do that easily with a transform geo. Plug that in here and scale up the base by a little bit, maybe 1.2. Okay, so for these, I want some super large particles that are moving pretty slowly overall. So something like this is actually not bad. I think we can increase the max lifetime more. This. And as we're working with particles that are slower like this, less and less of our timeline becomes a good representation of what the result looks like, because we have to wait for the particles to sort of spin up. So an easy way to get around this is actually just to set our start at time on each of the emitters to be a negative number, to start before the first frame. So I'll give us maybe 100 frames of pre-roll. Negative 100 is when we want to start. And I'll do the same thing on the other two emitters just to make this a little bit easier to work with. You don't want to set it back too far, otherwise it's going to have to calculate, 1,000 frames before you can see the first frame. So because we copied our last particle emitter, we've still got that varied velocity here and all that good stuff. That is looking nice. Of course, these are just squares here, so to see what we are doing, it's going to be nice to give ourselves a sprite. I'm going to do a similar recipe to what we've done before and make a reformat node. We'll do to box, And maybe this one we can have a little bit larger of a sprite since the sprites are going to be larger in the frame. So maybe 350 by 350. I'll drop down a noise. And then we want to do that same masking by a radial kind of effect that we did before. So put down a radial. And we multiply the two together. Oh, make sure you have your reformat node selected when you make the radial so that it actually conforms to the format. And now our noise is pushed to the wrong spot, so hook that back up to the reformat. Then we will composite these together using the multiply blend mode, and we have this. So that makes for a good sprite for now. We'll just leave it as a static thing so we can focus on the actual motion of the particles, but later we'll come back to add some motion to the sprite itself. So I'm going to plug this into our particle input. You can see what we've got here. Could be better. For one, our particles are not rotating at all. Oh, and just to make things easier to look at, let's do that same particle curve thing again. You know that we're going to need a blend mat, so I'm going to just copy this last one, paste that here. And then we'll do an alpha curve just like before to kind of fade in at the beginning, now fade out at the end. Control and Alt to make a new point on this graph. All right, looking pretty good. But how do we make the sprites rotate? Well, as far as I know, there's no way at all to make a 2D sprite rotate, unless you want to actually rotate the texture before you put it into the particle input. But what we can do is instead of using a 2D sprite, we actually make it into a 3D sprite. And we use a card that we plug in between this blend mat and our particle emitter. Now, you'll notice the sprites no longer rotate to follow our perspective, and they're actually real 2D geometry in the scene. And so this is real geometry, so it's going to be harder to render, but we can do more stuff with it. If I go into the card settings here, I'm just going to reduce the rows and columns down to the minimum to be a little bit less load on the computer. And now it's time to actually make the particles rotate. And so this is going to be a little bit hacky, but bear with me here. There is a setting inside of the particle emitter node called rotation velocity. And if we increase this, the particles do indeed begin to spin, although they're spinning around the wrong axis. Ideally, we'd want them to stay facing towards the Z direction and just spin about that axis, but instead they're spinning around the Y axis. And we can actually set the axis that they spin about by setting the normals of the input emitter geometry. So if we set the normals to be +1 on the Z, you can see they do spin around the proper axis, but now they're also moving in that direction. So I'm actually going to cancel out the velocity in our particle emitter, and we'll take care of that with a particle directional force node, which will also give us that acceleration that's more realistic than just a constant velocity. So turn up the strength to 1 there, and I'm just reducing the uniform strength to taste. There we go. And now we're getting an interesting effect here. I'm going to reduce this down even further. The smoke is moving quite fast as it stands. Maybe 0.0005. A little bit more than that. Yeah. So this is in the right direction, but again, not exactly what we're looking for here. Maybe I should modify my particle curve here so it's not building up so much at the bottom. There we go. So the velocity, rotation velocity is all constant right now. We can increase the range to make it a little bit more random, and that's going to look a little nicer. I can also use the particle drag node to introduce some rotational drag, which will make the rotation slow down as the particle increases in age. That's too much drag. That is getting more like it. I'm going to increase the initial rotation velocity to sort of make up for what we're losing there. And that is looking pretty cool. But remember, we wanted to make the rotation sort of rotate inwards towards the center as the particles are moving up. And so that means that we want the particles on the sort of negative side of the x-axis here to be spinning the direction they're currently spinning, but we want the particles on the other side of the origin here to be spinning in the opposite direction. So what we're going to do is actually make use of the rotation velocity channel. Now, what this lets us do is set the rotation velocity of the particles based on a texture that is applied to the input emit geometry. So you can see if I do a little apply material here and use a constant as our input and make it maybe 1 for now, I can use this RGBA.red, for example, because that's one of our colors that we just set with that constant, as the rotation velocity channel, and you'll see nothing has changed. But if we take this down to 0, suddenly we've got no rotation, and if we take it to -1, now we've got rotation in the opposite direction. So all we've got to do is make sure that our input particle emitter geometry has a negative value on the one side of the x-axis and a positive value on the other side. So I'm just going to make a texture that looks just like that. And if we remember correctly here, we're going to want the particles on the left side moving in the direction they're currently moving, so that we want a positive value for that. And the particles on the opposite side, we want a negative value for our texture. So I'm just going to make that quickly by going to our constant. I'm going to make a little grade node after it, set it to -1, and then we can mask this off with a roto. That was O for roto. And use the rectangle tool here to mask off about half of the frame. Of course, we also want to make sure black clamp is unchecked, so we actually have negative values over here. And now if we look at what we've got, there we have a negative value on the one side and a positive value on the other side. And it seems that the directions are reversed here. So I'm just gonna go into my grade node and check the invert button on the mask. Now it's on the correct side. So what's the result? Now the particles are spinning in towards the center, just like we wanted. And looking at this again, I think that the rotational drag is still too much. It's killing too much of the rotation too fast. We'll bring that down some more. Yeah, now we're looking dynamic, right? I also think I'd like to go back into the particle curve, make that fade in even slower, Control and Alt, click on the curve to make a new point, and then bring it down like this, slow fade in. Maybe not that slow. I think we should also increase the size, maybe even use the particle curve for that as well. So check size here, and then make it smaller at the bottom, larger at the top, and I think we want to go even beyond this value of 1, make it nice and big. Oh yeah. We could even add some turbulence, just like we did with the embers, some particle turbulence. I'll do the same thing as before, increasing our strength just a tiny bit, just needs a really small amount. 0.003 perhaps, as we've done before. Yeah, just a little something to give it some spread. And maybe a slight animation on the offset just to make it so it's not static. There we go. Okay. And as promised, we can go back into our noise texture and actually animate this as well. Give our Z offset a little expression, frame divided by 10 maybe. Oh, that's way too fast. Frame divided by 50. The smoke, it evolves slower. Yeah. Now we're looking like this. And we want to go in here and set our input frame start at random, just so we've got a good variety in here. Okay, now let's see how this actually looks with a scanline render. Once again, I'll just move these all down to be at the same level here and copy the scanline render node, hook it up to the same camera we've been using for everything, and hook it up to our new particle system here. And our result is this. And currently it took so long to render there because we've still got all of our motion blur samples being calculated here. I don't think we really need it as much for the smoke because it's slower than the embers. We'll turn that off. We're getting a really dynamic look here. Although it's definitely too strong overall. If we can bring down our gain and probably our gamma too, we'll get a more subtle effect. Probably also could stand to reduce our rotation amount by a little bit. So I'll go into our emitter settings and bring down the rotational velocity. Now, we don't want it stealing the show here, all right? There, that's looking more natural. Okay, cool. So we've got this. Now let's see if we can composite it together with our fire and our embers to make one complete scene here. So just immediately here, we'll try out a little plus operation like we've been using before, such as this. Swapping out our A and B so that the smoke is being added. That's looking pretty good. I think this is still too bright, but before we go in and adjust the value there, I want to actually make the fire appear as if it's lighting up the smoke, because I did notice that in our reference here. You can see how much the smoke is glowing right next to the fire. And it gets kind of blue in the background because of the color balance of the scene. So looking at this, all right, let's see if we can make it a bit more dynamic here. This is a pretty simple operation I'm going to do here. We're just going to blur out the fire and multiply it with the smoke. So I'm going to go over here right off the fire output and start blurring it. And whenever I get past a blur size of 100, just for my computer's sake, I don't like to turn it up any higher. Instead, what I do is bring in a reformat node, put it before the blur, and set the scale to something smaller. And as we decrease the scale, the blur gets larger. And this is because the blur size is staying the same, but 100 pixels takes up a much larger area on a 480 by 270 image than it does on a 1920 by 1080 image. And then after that, you're going to have to scale it back up with another reformat node. And the default setting will just bring it back up to 1920 by 1080 or whatever your root format is. So we've got this. And then before we add our smoke to the rest of the scene, I will multiply it by this image. There we go. And looking back at our reference again, smoke seems to be brighter than that right next to the fire. So bring up the gain by just a little bit. Maybe bring down the gamma. And maybe don't multiply it all the way, leave some in the background as well. Yeah, now we've got that little taper off there. That's looking pretty good. Although it does seem brighter after it tapers off than it does here. Maybe I'll increase the gain of the blurred fire image before it hits the multiply. That is brighter. And then we'll go into the grade. It was hitting the smoke before this multiply and bring it down so that it's at a reasonable level in the scene once again. Finally, okay, I kind of don't like how these embers are showing through the fire here, so instead of a plus, maybe we want to do an under. And that's not going to do anything right away because our fire doesn't really have a proper alpha channel. So I'm actually just going to put a keyer in here and use that to generate an alpha channel based on the luminance. And that's going to knock out the sparks that would otherwise be on top of the fire. Altogether, it's looking more like this. Nah, maybe we want a little bit more smoke. So let's have a look at how this looks. I think there's a couple things I want to change. The smoke seems too bright to me in motion. Things always seem to be more eye-catching when they are moving than they are when they're not moving. I want the smoke to be just a subtle accent on this. I also think I was too aggressive with that opacity curve on this. I like to have the smoke a little bit more visible towards the bottom of this thing. Maybe I'll bring this up like this. just looking at our output directly from the scanline render node, right, there's definitely stuff down there. But I really want to see some smoke down here. Maybe I could even just grade up just that area with a little roto, such as this. Feather it out, and boost up the gain with this grade. Yeah, now we've got a little something down there. That should hopefully highlight more of that hard work we put into the rotation on the particle sprites. Move this down a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Okay, cool. And I think I'll probably need to actually reduce down the gain on this again. All right, also, final touch, hey. Why not go all out a little bit? Add some glow. Doesn't have to be anything crazy. Doesn't have to look like this. Just mean a little bit of glow on a large scale, like that. There we go. Just enough to make it pop. All right. Let's have a look at this. And there we have it. The final result of all our hard work. Not just one fire asset, but actually many. You can go in here, change the settings on any of these particle systems that you have, change the random seed, and you've got a brand new asset to work with. And I hope that not only have you learned how to make some fire here, but you've also learned something about how to use your artistic eye to look at reference critically, and also something about Nuke's particle system. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, dear viewer, for watching this video. I'd also like to thank Foundry for having me here on their channel. Once again, my name is Julian Cruiser. You can find me over on nodesaren'tscary.com or here on YouTube at Nodes Aren't Scary. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.